Hello and welcome to Society Language Difference. It's our 6th week, so this week we're going to look at Jacques Derrida, the philosopher the analytical world loves to hate. Here he is, a figure of great loathing and a figure of great love. Our agenda this week is to make sense of this man. We're going to look at his text Off Grammatology, and we're going to have a bit of a context about this and what it means. We want to get into the significance of his ideas. We're going to try and relate them to stuff that we've already done on our course. We'll need, I know it can be tough at times, but we'll need to kind of get into what structuralism means. And then through this, we can explore to what extent Derrida is a post-structuralist, if that applies. We can't hide from these terms for too much longer. And then at the end, we're going to appraise to what extent Derrida is useful and exciting and invigorating for our thinking, or is he just an obscurantist? Somebody, I'm not going to give you the quotes. You can hear him being absolutely savage later. But the point is, after Spinoza, not to condemn, curse, or mourn, but to understand. Let's see how we get on. So actually, no, I'm not going to give you the agenda. Let's talk a bit more about the reception. What am I thinking? Okay, there's lots of interesting guides on Derrida. Let's hear about how Derrida characterizes his own work in his own words. We're going to just really briefly, just 2 books. You'll also notice throughout this that there's going to be lots of really cool pictures of Derrida. He is a very cool philosopher, and he knows it. He's very good at projecting his presence in photos. There's a lot of films about him, a lot of documentaries. Okay, right, Derrida. This is from a work called Plato's Pharmacy. Already we're getting a sense of the irreverent approach to philosophy. Derrida says, quote, "A text remains forever imperceptible. Its laws and its rules are not, however, harboured in the inaccessibility of a secret. It is simply that they can never be booked in the present into anything that could rigorously be called a perception." Okay. Now there's something meandering and possibly really quite insightful about this. The very nature of what he's talking about is that the text remains imperceptible, that it cannot be reduced to a singular, secret, universal truth. Everything is always kind of framed and maybe even distorted by the context in which it's in, which all sounds okay, maybe sounds sympathetic, but it's that prose, isn't it? It's so slippery. Don't we want meaning? Don't we want clarity? But isn't that part of the problem? Imposing simplistic thought on what is far too complex. Okay, I'm going to need to do more persuading. It can't just be there. This is from a book that Derrida writes later in his life called The Politics of Friendship in I think it's the early or mid-90s. This isn't about friendship. This is great though. Derrida, quote, "What is going to come, perhaps, is not only this or that. It is at last the thought of the perhaps itself. Imperceptible, indeterminate, vague, out of reach, ungraspable. On one level, this reflects quite an insightful view of the difficulties of accessing a singular universal meaning or truth. Everything is framed by context. There are always things about the author, about the position in which a text, a book is released, that frame and shape and distort its meaning. How can we always be so sure that we know what something means? Isn't there always some kind of supposition or guesswork going on, perhaps? Or maybe this is bullshit." From Existential Comics. Where else? This actually, I think I showed you this last week with Jacques Lacan, but this is an earlier part. This is a comic strip, a talent contest for France's next great philosopher. And in this scene, we've got a contestant who is just talking a load of waffle. Let's hear it. Okay. So Foucault is addressing the contestant. Foucault says, "Okay, Pierre, you are next. Let's hear what you've got." Contestant: "It's a critique of Hegel's concept of time." Foucault: "Go ahead." The contestant. And here comes a load of waffle. Okay, don't worry, this is pure waffle. After defining the internal necessity of the self-presentation of the concept, Hegel identifies its external necessity, the necessity that takes time into account as the existence Dasein of the concept. But it is at first only a question of the necessity of time as a universal form of sensibility. One must then go on to recognize the gap between... And don't worry. So Derrida interrupts him. Derrida: okay, I'm going to stop you there. Lacan: Derrida, what do you think? Derrida: I'll be honest, I didn't understand what you were talking about, not even a bit. And I loved every second of it. Derrida continues: your prose does an amazing job of being elitist and obscure. My only problem is that you didn't make up any new words. A great philosopher always invents new words, so everyone knows that their philosophy is so original that they cannot express it in ordinary language. Like when I came up with the term différance, or when Foucault coined the term biopower. What you actually get in some of the later existential comics is a bit less of a diss against Derrida, but the diss is pretty clear. Derrida is someone who kind of celebrates, who welcomes writing in an obscure and difficult way, which is therefore an elitist way. He doesn't want to be understood. And this maybe reflects, and this is a criticism that you get of Derrida in different directions from the more kind of plain-speaking, analytical world of English-speaking philosophy, but also even among Marxists on the left, that this is a load of jargon and cant, and it doesn't really mean anything. It's everything means something different. You know, there's no such thing outside of text. All there is words and language games. And Derrida is the prince of nonsense in that respect, a jargon that only his disciples claim to understand. This is the implication of the existential comic, that he's glad to hear a load of bullshit. We're going to challenge this. Let's have a look at another comic. I can't remember where this is from. I just found it on Google Images, if I'm totally honest with you. This is Derrida did the Deconstructionator, and here he's depicted as like Terminator. But, I mean, it's a long comic strip, but it makes a useful point at the beginning about why Derrida would be so interested in what language means and doesn't mean. And I won't just read out to you what's in this comic strip, but the point that I mentions here, and it's paraphrasing something from this 2002 Derrida documentary. Actually, I've put this up on Moodle. Eleanor sent me a good link. You can watch it in full. It's really good. That Derrida was excluded, he was expelled from school in the year 1942, as were all Jews. And so there's this interest in the conditions of fascism and how fascism emerges, which we've seen on our course with all our thinkers in different ways. And that Derrida's opposition to fascism, opposition to anti-Semitism, in a way takes place partly through a detailed exploration about what language puts across and what language conceals. We'll explore this more and more as we go along. But there's still the other material that we need to get through, which is the idea that maybe what this conceals, the obscure prose, blah, 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 is total relativism. Let's have a look at another comic strip. This is one that we saw, I think, in the first week. So one guy is standing on another's neck, kind of like this, suffocating him. The guy is much bigger. And so the guy who's been strangled is, understandably complaining. He says, ouch, you're standing on my neck. The big guy standing on him says, well, that's one point of view. But one could also say that you're trying to trip me with your neck. You see, in the postmodern condition, we create our own reality based upon our internalized preconceptions. Since there is no longer one objective truth, we are free to create our own truth. So, you see, there is no right and wrong, just an infinite number of equally valid stories. The other guy. But you're still standing on my neck. The big guy. You never went to college, did you? Now, you might be wondering, why do we bring in postmodernism there? And that's because when we're dealing with the reputation of Derrida in the English-speaking world, it's through this kind of haze about what postmodernism is and what postmodernism means. We're going to look at this in the final week. I mean, being in a postmodern condition is something that starts being defined and presented from the late 1970s. So it's after what we're going to look at off Grammatology, which is 1967. But Derrida's often associated with what postmodernism is supposed to mean. This idea that, you know, nothing is true and nothing is false. It's all just narratives. It partly draws on Foucault. Everything is shaped by power. But then the kind of the implication, at least in the way that postmodernism is framed in this kind of cartoon and elsewhere, is that, you know, because everything is shaped by power, true and false don't really mean anything. They're just your perspective or my perspective. And so what Derrida does by this kind of focus on language and what language hides, and that language cannot ever reach a universal singular truth, is he opens the way to bullshit and to lies. And interestingly, you get this, there's a debate among historians, or there was a few years ago, about this, like Richard Evans and others, that could Derrida, could postmodernism, could these ideas be somehow complicit in Holocaust denial? Say, take something like the David Irving trial. David Irving was a major Nazi historian, and he produced a lot of works on Hitler, and he kind of grudgingly makes more explicit the view that the Holocaust didn't take place in the way that it's been described. That it's kind of been invented by Jewish people and Polish people and others. And so this ends up going to trial, the Deborah Lipstadt trial, Penguin Books versus David Irving, blah, blah, blah. The point being that if we come to a view that everything, it comes down to language, but, you know, there isn't any kind of singular truth that language refers to, then what's going to be our basis for opposing lies? Lies, say, about the Holocaust, or about the genocide in Rwanda and so on, or Bosnia. It's a danger of relativism, isn't it? And Derrida is seen as a big problem. Again, we're going to need to tread carefully. Let's hear more accusations. These are from two enemies again. And these kind of give you what you've already been hearing in a bit more depth. So Mark Goldblatt, in a piece called The Derrida Achievement, says, quote, Derrida's special significance lies not in the fact that he was subversive, but in the fact that he was an outright intellectual fraud. Whatever Derrida is affirming, he is also simultaneously denying. From a logical perspective, the only way to read Derrida on his own terms is mentally to insert the phrase or not after every one of his statements. Now you might be thinking, kind of justifiably, that this is too harsh, it's too crude, but maybe there could be a risk or a danger that he opens himself up to with this kind of experimental, very self-referential form of writing. Richard Rorty, another important philosopher, American of the English-speaking world, obviously, says he's talking about another guy who you're going to meet later on, John Searle. John Searle hates Derrida, and Richard Rorty says John Searle is right. Quote: John Searle is right in saying that a lot of Derrida's arguments are just awful. Okay, so we kind of had this bit of Lacan, didn't we, last week? The Lacan quoting hipsters, the people that Dominic Cummings hates. The reputation and the furore around Derrida is even worse. We're going to meet one more villain of an English-speaking world in a few weeks' time, Jean Baudrillard, who says that the Gulf War didn't take place. You'll read this, and basically, this causes people to have a fit, like a lot of English-speaking journalists and writers. Anyway, we'll get to this. Let me just set out the agenda for today. So this is what we're going to do. We've got to know who this guy is. Who is Jacques Derrida? Jackie Derrida, as his parents called him. We're then going to get into a bit of background. In part 2, we're going to look at structuralism. I promise you it'll be the last time we do it. Then we're going to get stuck into the work that I asked you to look at, off Grammatology. And we're going to look at some specific parts of this. We're going to look at what Derrida means by logocentrism and why that's a bad thing, apparently. And then we're going to look at the concept of différance. And then we're going to go to some of the stuff that I've already been alluding to, the legacy stuff with John Searle and others. Okay, right. So we're going to begin with biography, but Derrida says, you know, biography is going to raise more questions than answers. Quote, as you know, the traditional philosophy excludes biography, considers biography as something external to philosophy. You remember Heidegger's statement about Aristotle? Heidegger once was asked, what was the life of Aristotle? The one thing that could be answered is very simple. Aristotle was a philosopher. He was born, he fought, and he died. And all the rest. It's pure anecdote. Okay. So we have a figure who very much would resist us giving a purely biographical interpretation of his life and times, but tough. Part of my training is being as a historian, and that's what we're going to do. Let's look at Jacques Derrida's life. Okay, so here he is. So, Derrida. He's born in Algeria to a Jewish family, a Sephardic Jewish family, in 1930. Now, Algeria, you know it's important. It's come up a lot, hasn't it? Came up a lot when we looked at Frantz Fanon. Also came up when we looked at the response to the Algerian War of Independence and the divisions among French intellectuals. We looked at Sartre's kind of support for violence in the preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. But then we compared that with Albert Camus and his real discomfort around violence. So Derrida's from Algeria, but from a Sephardic Jewish family, born in 1930. And like basically everyone else on our course, kind of grows up during the rise and fall of the Nazis. So Algeria, up until its independence, is considered a département, like a county really of France. You know, not like a colony. It was considered for administrative purposes like a county, like it was part of the state of France. And so he's at a French school. And as you'll remember from previous weeks, what we get in France at the beginning of the Second World War is collaboration, shockingly. Not for everybody, not among everybody, but under Field Marshal Pétain, when France is invaded, they decide that France will be a nominally independent state, but it'll be ruled from Vichy. We call it Vichy France. Pétain's government is very anti-Semitic. It's very complicit in Nazism in lots of ways. So Derrida is expelled from school in 1942. That was in that comic strip earlier, wasn't it? Because there were these anti-Semitic quotas. Now, what was meant to happen here was that Derrida was, like other Jewish kids, would have gone to a Jewish school. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he kind of stays at home and he plays lots of football. And that's nothing. There's a link that we can be drawn with philosophers and football. There is quite a few actually. I can't remember others, but Camus is one. Camus is also a very keen footballer, also from Algeria. So there's some facts. So Derrida is. So he's kind of too young to be involved in any kind of military resistance or anything like that. And he ends up studying in France. His kind of his early life is, I don't know. So it's marked by anti-Semitism. There's also these other kind of curious facets about his early life. You get this in the Derrida 2002 documentary. You know that his eldest, he's a third in the family, and his what would have been his older brother dies a year before he's born, and Derrida has this kind of suspicion throughout his life that he was born to replace his older brother because he was born not long after the brother died. He goes to France and he kind of, I guess he studies at a fairly conventional school, but his intellectual gifts are noticed quite early on. He manages to get into the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. Well, not straight away. He fails. Should bring him back up. He fails the exam first time round, but he keeps pressing on and then he gets in. At least in terms of the Algeria connection, he ends up teaching, because of part of the military service at the time, he ends up teaching soldiers' children rather than having to fight for the French for a couple of years. He's got very very widely varied influences. I'm just gonna, this is an image of the, I guess, the kind of unique kind of Sephardic Jewish North African settlement of peoples. You know, I'll bring up another. Yeah, this is from, oh, this is kind of French war propaganda with Churchill being depicted as like an octopus. And here is Derrida as a young man. So Derrida, as well as skiving off playing football, becomes very interested. I think he's very interested in literature. You probably get this from the way that he writes enough Grammatology and a wide range of references. Very interested in writers like André Gide. Also very interested in James Joyce. Spends I think about a year kind of studying James Joyce in a library. I suppose if you're trying to place him philosophically, the major influences on him are Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, and we're going to talk probably more about Husserl later on in this. Now he starts coming to prominence in, oh yeah, God, sorry, my timing is not that good today. These are some images from the Algerian War of Independence. Let me bring this up. Okay, right, yeah, he starts coming to prominence in the mid-1960s. He has this kind of like amazing year, 1967, where a lot of works come out at the same time. Off Grammatology, which is what we're going to look at, but also Speech and Phenomena and Writing and Difference. In fact, it's the mid-1960s where Derrida comes to the fore. And I suppose you could compare this with people like Fanon or Foucault. They're emerging late 1950s into the early 60s, and perhaps that's part of one of the many things that represents with Derrida a kind of wind of change against the prevailing fashion for structuralism towards something different. Okay, let's just look at a bit of the timeline. So 1952, yep, yeah, he meets Foucault now, Althusser. I'm wondering if I'm going to bring it up. Actually, I don't think I am in this class. He basically has a big falling out with Foucault over the interpretation of madness as civilization, where Derrida kind of accuses Foucault of being kind of too simplistic and trying to speak for the mad who have been silenced in a way that's not possible. And then Foucault ends up writing this kind of quite ratty critical reply. They sort of spar a bit in their interpretation of Descartes. For your purposes, they know each other, they're friends, but they have this intellectual beef going off at the same time. Yeah, he kind of comes to prominence, writing on Husserl. Yep. So maybe one thing that makes Derrida different from the people that we've looked at so far is that he's well known in the United States, and this happens quite quickly. So in Structure, Sign and Play, which is the name of a paper that he gives at a conference in 1966, Derrida he kind of issues this challenge to structuralism, basically. And when this kind of the papers from this conference are published, it's called the Structuralist Controversy, reflecting the outcry from young Derrida's very exciting paper. I say young, he's about 36, but philosophically this is young. And Derrida, through teaching, when he's teaching these soldiers' children in Algeria, he's teaching in French and English, and so he's very fluent in English, and this means that he spends a lot of time giving papers in the United States and ends up getting a position at the University of California in 1986. And so he's somebody, and this partly explains why Derrida is more well known in the English-speaking world, even in sometimes quite a suspicious way, because he's given his papers and because he's got a lot of contacts. Yale University in particular, maybe this also means that he ends up being associated with a kind of Ivy Tower, Ivy League elitism as well. Let's go back to his timeline. So yep, 1967, that's a key year. 1974, Glas. Okay, you're wondering about this, aren't you? What's Glas? And this is a really kind of curious experimental kind of work of philosophy, really. That comes out in 74, and I think, without kind of waffling on too much about it, reflects Derrida's kind of interest in his writing. Even though it's curious, Derrida calls himself a historian, but he writes, you know, like an experimental writer in lots of ways. And maybe that might be a useful way of trying to pigeonhole him. That he's not just trying to kind of push thinking in new ways, but he's also trying to push the way that, or he's not just trying to push the way that we understand the writing of philosophy and the way that we historicize it. He's also trying to kind of challenge and experiment in how we write about that history as well. Just as I encouraged you in week 2 to kind of think of the Frankfurt School in terms of literary modernism, I think it'd be useful kind of having that in mind too in terms of the way that Derrida writes. In case you're thinking, oh, this is really frustrating, he doesn't give definitions at the beginning or anything like that. Well, have in mind here this whole training in James Joyce, you know, this whole interest in pushing language, not doing it in order to kind of make you, make me, or make anyone feel stupid. Far from it. Literary modernism, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, is all about making it new. It's about pushing and experimenting with a form of writing in order to kind of deliver new ways of thinking about a new kind of world that we inhabit. And that, I hope you'd agree, is worthwhile, because when we see it in painting, let's say like Francis Bacon or someone else, or Picasso, we think, okay, it's weird, it's interesting, it's extremely worthwhile, because it enables us to perceive the world in new ways. And that's what his writing is trying to do as well, even though it's frustrating, because at least when it comes to Derrida, it necessitates having a lot of philosophical training already. Back to the time. So Glass comes out in 74. In 86, he becomes a professor at California. There's this whole controversy when Cambridge University wants to give him an honorary doctorate, but more or less all the philosophy folk there say no. Don't give him an honorary degree because his writing is unclear and obscure. You know, he's a pseudo-intellectual. And there's a vote, and Derrida kind of wins out in the end. But you know, to be honest, it's quite close. And Derrida says, well, you know, the reason why they don't want to give me an honorary doctorate is because my thinking, you know, challenges the orthodoxy. And he's right. He's right. But his critics are also right. His writing style is very hard to understand. 1994, Spectres of Marx and the Politics of Friendship come out. Should I say anything more about that? No, I probably won't. I think you've got enough to chew on already. These The Politics of Friendship is a nice book. It's an interesting book. And okay, I'll say one thing. That there's more of an emphasis on politics and ethics later in his work. Sometimes people say that he has like an ethical turn or whatever. Yeah, he probably doesn't, but there's just more of an emphasis there. You know, maybe he's kind of reacting to the charge that he's too focused on language, and you know, there's almost amoral about what he's putting across before. And then he passes away, I think, in the year 2004. I'm just trying to think. I think he, in terms of lives and deaths on this course, he is one of the most recent of our thinkers. But Baudrillard, I think, dies in 2007. Probably going to get this wrong and look really stupid. So I'll right, let's get into it. So this is our agenda. Well, we've had our agenda. We're going to look at the philosophical roots of off-grammatology, and then we are going to look at the specific arguments. So, the 3 H's. You know who I mean, don't you? I hope. Now, with Derrida, although he's interested in the grumpy-looking man on the right, the focus for this part is going to be the guy looking rather serious on the left. And not much to do with the guy in the middle. We had him more last week. Did we? Yeah, we did. So Derrida is really interested in Edmund Husserl and phenomenology. Now you're thinking, right, what is phenomenology? This is Husserl with Heidegger. I know a bit young. Okay, so phenomenology is an early 20th century philosophical movement associated with Edmund Husserl. And Husserl is reacting against positivism associated with a guy called, my French pronunciation is terrible, I apologize, Auguste Comte. Positivism was a 19th century, I guess, philosophical kind of outlook, which said that what we need to do now is bring philosophy up to the standard of the sciences. You know, we need to make philosophy as rigorous as scientific inquiry. You know, it should strive for an objective truth. You know, all of the stuff about philosophy being a way of life or about ethics or anything like that. Okay, that's interesting, but that's now a historical curiosity because we need to kind of fit philosophy into the wider human sciences. Now, Husserl is worried about this, and he's not sure about what this is going to mean. He thinks that if we try and reduce, you know, such a marvelous, the queen of all sciences, to something that is just kind of scientific and almost like laboratory-like, then we're gonna lose philosophy's original calling. We're gonna make it. Philosophy is never going to be as good as the sciences in terms of delivering scientific insight. It's never going to give us graphs and equations, nor should we strive for something that looks like that, because that's not what philosophy ultimately aims to do. It's not about trying to describe things in the world. It's about trying to instead account for and explain how we think, about providing a foundation for thought. And what Husserl wanted to do was to kind of turn the clock back a bit and say, let's, instead of trying to, you know, upgrade how philosophy describes things and making it a bit pseudoscientific, instead, why don't we turn philosophy back to an earlier point, back to lived experience, back to human consciousness and the things that we are conscious of, the phenomena that we are conscious of, and how phenomena, these impressions or representations in our mind, are acts of consciousness. I don't know why I stopped this here. I'll come back to this in a moment. So there's this kind of, so there's a focus on lived experience. And for Husserl and Heidegger later, there's an interest in trying to understand about how what we experience, the world of experience, is made meaningful by a transcendental consciousness. What they're interested in doing is accounting philosophically for how experience is possible in our minds, the conditions of possibility of experience. So this isn't just about trying to think about how things appear in the world, like a road sign, like an image of a pipe, but more about the conditions in which that thinking, these impressions become possible in the first place. So it's almost like pre-impressions, if that makes sense. And maybe in that sense, it's kind of, I mean, I don't know how valid this is, but it's reminding me a bit of Immanuel Kant and Immanuel Kant's interest in the underlying categories that make thinking possible in different ways. Now, when it comes to phenomenology, maybe there's also something that's slightly romantic about this too. That it brings us back to a kind of a struggling, heroic, romantic individual who is striving to make sense of the things that they're surrounded by. You know, but clear and unclear, known and unknown, friendly and hostile. And how our minds are involved in this heroic struggle to understand, to make sense. Which is all very interesting. Now, Derrida is interested in phenomenology very much, but he's also influenced by structuralism, which we've come across in previous weeks too. Again, a French intellectual philosophical movement that emerges in the 1940s across the 50s and becomes quite influential, particularly influential in the 50s and into the 60s, into the mid-1960s. In some ways, it hasn't ever stopped being influential because people like Maurice Merleau-Ponty or Claude Lévi-Strauss are widely read today. It's just that, at least with Derrida and Foucault, there is a slight challenge to some of the universalizing assumptions that the structuralists come out with. Now, an important figure in structuralism, something that we've talked about a little bit already, is a guy called Saussure. Again, I apologize for my pronunciation. I know it sucks. Ferdinand De Saussure. Now, he isn't around in France in the 1950s. He is teaching in Switzerland, I think, and he produces, well, it's kind of transcribed, so he doesn't quite write it, a course in general linguistics, 1916. Now, Saussure was interested in the how language could be understood through universal underlying structures. That language should be seen as an objective system of signs. But how do you make sense of all of these different signs? It's through how they relate to one another. That we make sense of something through it being not like something else. And so therefore that meaning is determined by difference. The difference between different units. You know, red is not blue or not green or not yellow. And with Saussure too, you get a big emphasis on the signifier and the signified. Okay, so now that makes, let's go back to now. No, you know, this is what we looked at in previous weeks. You know, it's a sign that's not in use, but it is a sign. A sign is, it's a sign telling us something, but a sign telling us that's not in use. These are kind of paradoxical, really. But the point that Saussure is trying to put across is that images and words as sounds, as speech sounds, refer to existing things or things that we can imagine. You know, like a unicorn doesn't exist, but we can imagine it. David Hume says when we take the elements of two other existing things and put them together, like a rhino and a horse or whatever. So you have the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the sound, it's the image of the pipe, it's the word pipe. But the signified is an actual pipe that you might have in your hands and use. Okay. And at least when it comes to Saussure, there is a big emphasis on difference being understood in terms of opposites, like night versus day, black versus white, animal versus human, and so on. Yeah, these are one of the things he says. Now, this becomes influential and interesting in 1940s, 50s France. Merleau-Ponty on the left, Lévi-Strauss in the middle, and just enough image of Saussure on the right. And what they do, these guys, is they take what Saussure has to say about language, about this universal structure of language structures, and they apply it into different areas like anthropology for Lévi-Strauss or psychology and politics. We had this with Roland Barthes a few weeks ago, that he implies the same thing to popular culture in the work Mythologies. And on the front covers of magazines, so, you know, how you could use these to kind of present, to explore how rituals and myths and ideas are kind of communicated even in a very mundane way. Now, by using this kind of linguistics, science-driven approach, semiotics, the study of science, science-driven approach, language becomes at the center of everything, doesn't it? And that's important for us. You know, our course, after all, is called Society, Language and Difference. You know, that's why Saussure and his interpretation is always going to be quite important for us. And so what we get with structuralism is something that's actually kind of different from phenomenology. So I guess I need to kind of make this distinction more apparent. That whereas phenomenology is emphasizing lived experience and understanding consciousness, and therefore understanding the self that perceives, the structuralists are quite different. They're saying, well, even that self is, you know, structured by and a consequence of structures of language. So language becomes key. It's not the self that perceives. The self is a product of language. But what does language itself reflect? Well, for Saussure, language is kind of defined by difference. And how do we understand difference if we're going to, you know, take it outside of words? Well, when it comes to identity, it's through difference between ourselves and others. I am not you, you are not me. So our social relationships are what make up and constitute our identity, not a private self that looks outwards like the Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So our structuralists are issuing a kind of challenge to phenomenology. They're saying it overprivileges the self. It doesn't really explain what the self is, and the self is a kind of consequence of language. And maybe there's something that's interesting and important in the challenge that the structuralists make. And maybe I should have put more of them on the course so that you could read them and make up your own mind. When Lévi-Strauss is doing this anthropological work, he's trying to challenge ideas that the West is, you know, superior in civilization to other places. You know, he sees a unique complexity in the myths of other places, so a complexity and a value that is equal to anything that we get from Homer. Merleau-Ponty very much is challenging the phenomenological assumption that the mind is more worthy of study than the body. Far from it. So this is the kind of the intellectual milieu in which Derrida emerges, and in which he's offering a kind of challenge in his work of grammatology. So let's get stuck into this book. So this is Derrida here. Again, looking kind of dapper, although this is a slightly more dated image. And he's with his translator, Gayatri Spivak. So what is this book trying to do off grammatology? What's it going to do with these two threads that were presented, phenomenology and structuralism? Well, it's going to be a kind of blending and untangling, if that makes sense. I'll just give you a quote from Derrida. But the one who reads a text by a philosopher, say a tiny paragraph, and interprets it in a rigorous, inventive, and powerfully deciphering fashion, is more of a real biographer than the one who knows the whole story. Maybe we should do the same. Forget all that sketch about Algeria and Jewishness. Close, meticulous, exhaustingly pedantic readings. You do get this a lot of Derrida. Because it's going to tell us about the conditions of language, the conditions in which someone thinks. So maybe that's far more important than us making suppositions about a person's relationship to their parents and what have you. We're going to untangle, unfold, and scrutinize the way that people think by the way in which they use language and the ways in which they write. And for Derrida, writing, not speech, is what matters and is what needs to be scrutinized. Let's get into this book. That's the quote. So what is Off Grammatology 1967 trying to do? Well, Derrida says that it is an investigation into a critical science of writing, which he calls grammatology. So a critical science of writing. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this book is produced in order for Derrida to kind of, pass his doctorate in France, which is more complex and harder to get than it is in the UK. And he's kind of, the way he presents his work is around the study of writing and language. Now, Derrida's argument is this, that Western philosophy has been guilty of prioritizing speech over writing. And that's what he wants to kind of challenge and in some ways overturn. That if we need to think about a kind of writing that is pure writing, is archaic writing, and isn't, just kind of speech transcribed on the page. But what Derrida is trying to do in the process, remember, it's not necessarily a positive project. Maybe this is a useful way of thinking about the broader method of deconstruction, of taking literary texts or philosophical texts and then trying to unpick their meanings. It's a critical project, it's a negative project, it's a skeptical project. It's not trying to say, this is what writing should be like and here are some good examples. It's trying to say, this is how writing has been done and here are some presumptions, here are some presuppositions that we are not always aware of with it. Here are some things that it presents as straightforward and simple, but actually they're difficult and complex and contradictory. If we take that with Derrida, then maybe we can see even more value in what he's trying to do in a skeptical project. Okay, so some of the influences of this work are those that we've just been talking about. Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, Rousseau is another. Now, Derrida is challenging something that he sees. Well, he sees it in Husserl and other places. That the possibility that you can have a sign, like a word, concept, that can refer entirely and purely to a thing outside of it, that is distant from it. That we can have the word freedom and it might connote a kind of an abstract kind of idea or realm of freedom to it. Derrida is saying that this isn't possible. There is no pure sign. There's always going to be a struggle where in order to understand what a word refers to, like freedom, say written down on the page. In order to understand the concept that it refers to, we cannot assume that that concept of freedom, that ideal, exists in itself as like a pure essence that somehow language can connect to and communicate with. You might want to think of the way that Plato in his forms, the chair in front of you corresponds to the form of the chair in this abstract realm of ideas or forms of pure ideas. They're just saying, no, that's not possible. That all of these signs, these words, and so on, they refer to things beyond them, signifiers. But these signifiers aren't pure in themselves. They are constructed and they are shaped and they are modified by context, by society, by the world in which they sit. Therefore, the whole phenomenological striving to consciousness, to lived experience, to a self, is trying to find something, word, to get to something that's beyond language, something that's pure self. But that isn't possible. That's not to say that there isn't a self. That's not to say that there isn't freedom. Don't worry about all that skeptical, Derrida, believes that evil and truth are all the same thing. It doesn't mean that. What it simply means is that these concepts, these meanings are shaped by context, they're shaped by language, they're shaped by use. That to me doesn't sound so problematic. That to me sounds useful. Let's keep going. I'm just trying to give a bit of a kind of intro to what this book is trying to do. Okay. So there is all this going on. Right, let's have a look at, this is from the excerpt, which is what we're going to look at in our Zoom meeting. I gave you quite a short reading because I know this work is quite it's quite dense and kind of hard to get into. And now that you've heard that quote from Derrida, you will know that all we need to do is just read a very short paragraph, and that's it. Anyway, some very interesting things come up quite early on in Off Grammatology. Some things that are exciting and that are useful. One of the things that Derrida talks about very quickly is that there is an ethnocentrism at the heart of writing. Well, at least when we say writing, don't come back and say, oh, hold on a minute, what about writing in China? He's talking about really the history of like Western philosophy, the Western tradition, we could call it. That there is this kind of, this focus or an over-regard, this elevation of Western culture, of ancient Greek culture. So there's this thing, this is present there. Okay, we kind of got this a little bit when we looked at Fanon as well. Derrida also has this term logocentrism. This focus, this over-centering on speech and what that means and how that can be a problem. Derrida says in this excerpt at the beginning that he's trying to produce a critical survey of the possibility of writing itself. And it has this kind of, I don't know, messianic is probably the wrong word, but this slightly utopian focus to it as well. That he's interested in kind of this critique of language in order to produce something that will be of use, will be of service for the ineluctable world of the future, which proclaims itself at present beyond the closure of knowledge, which is very typically quite dense and ineluctable, while that we cannot reach or know. Something that is contingent and possible, and that we can shape and that we can strive for. This is viable, and this is what we can do with language, and this is what we should do in different ways. Let's get into this concept of logocentrism. I know I was a bit vague. You heard the hesitation in my voice, didn't you? Let's try and pinpoint what he means by this. So what does he mean, logocentrism? It's unlikely to ever come up in a pub quiz, but you never know. So what does he mean? So Derrida says that there is, throughout Western thought, I remember it's focused on Western thought, a prioritization of speech over writing. So logos, here it's translated as speech, but logos in Greek is actually much broader. It can mean thought, it can mean law, it can mean reason. For the Stoics, Stoic philosophy, logos pervades everything and it's a universal harmony. So it doesn't really mean speech in that respect. So Derrida's kind of reading this stuff in a certain way. Now, one thing that isn't quite clear enough to me from the excerpt, and something we could talk about, is what are the problems with speech? Why is it a bad thing to prioritize speech over writing? Well, I mean, it kind of, as Derrida acknowledges, and I'm sure all historians would probably accept, there was speech before there was writing, wasn't there? And that writing is a representation of things that we say. It might not be phonetic, but it represents things that we speak to each other. Not always, of course. You might be thinking of kind of holy languages, that aren't kind of really meant to be spoken. I'm thinking here of Hebrew. And so what grammatology is trying to do is kind of think about what a kind of language would mean which wasn't kind of beholden to speech. And I guess maybe wasn't so beholden to the way in which speech shapes, distorts what words mean in the present in relation to power structures in a given society. Now, grammatology kind of has this kind of view in mind that we could develop an understanding of writing as something that is separate from speech and contains more freedom. Maybe we might want to think of this in terms of literary modernism of James Joyce and that again. That if we can kind of free up writing, then we can free up the possibility of creating new concepts. But Derrida has this kind of skeptical, this deconstructive view in mind as well. And this is one that is kind of more skeptical and more probably more objected to. Now, there is an illusion often in language that there is a reality beyond language, that, and this goes back to the examples I gave of freedom earlier, that language can refer to a pure truthful thing beyond it, an unmediated experience of truth, a reality beyond language. And this is where we're going to get to the really controversial stuff in a minute. When Derrida, and it's translated, says there is no such thing outside the text, the implication seems to be, and because the writing is quite vague, it's possible to kind of read different things out of it. The implication seems to be that all there is language. All there is language games. So therefore, the traditional philosophical journey for trying to understand the truth and speaking truth to power and all that kind of thing doesn't matter because it's all just words and language games. Now, that isn't what Derrida is saying. Derrida is saying what they're trying to put across is that the language that we use, that we write, it refers to things, but the things that it refers to don't have a pure, pure universal life outside of the society in which they're used. We have to always be attentive to context. We have to always be attentive to power. This is actually a real Foucault point. Derrida doesn't quite say this, sorry. It's just Foucault's in mind at the moment. We have to always be attentive to how relationships shape and structure language in this way. Let's look at a couple of bits of grammatology. So I don't know how well this animation is gonna animate. Oh, it hasn't worked out well. Oh man. Okay, so if you just ignore the things on the right and just look at the things on the left. So I want to make it just a quick contrast between structuralism and what Derrida is trying to do, which we'll call deconstruction. Traditionally, Saussure, structuralism, a signifier refers to a signified. A word refers to a thing. Okay, that sounds right, doesn't it? Now, deconstruction is kind of different. Okay, that worked all right. That signifies that words refer to other words, but they haven't got pure access to a signified thing. That's not to say that, that image, this is not a pipe. That means that there is no such thing as actual pipes, that we can smoke if we want to. Doesn't mean that. But it means that the way in which we use pipe is, the way that we understand pipe is in relation to lots of other different words and symbols in which a pipe has a meaning. A pipe is not a cigarette or a cigar, and so forth. That the meaning of a pipe becomes shaped by the world in which a pipe has meaning, if that makes sense. I know I'm being a bit vague, I'm sorry. I'll give you a bit more in a moment. There's something else that the work is trying to do as well, which I think this is kind of interesting. This is from Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and it's this whole idea, going to nature because nature is beautiful, and in nature we can live a purer and more simple and tranquil life, uncorrupted by civilization. For us it's here, I wish to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. Now, off Grammatology is offering a kind of challenge to this kind of sentimental view of nature. I guess it's really in the idea that there is in nature this kind of pure nature, if that makes sense. That we can go off the grid and go back to nature with a capital N. What is that nature? Just in the same way, what is that truth with a capital T? Where does that dwell? Does nature dwell in a certain part of the United States, or I don't know, in rural Wales or somewhere? Or is nature something that is partly imagined? I don't mean that in a bad way, like a fantasy, but is nature something that is is given kind of social and cultural meanings that change over time? Well, yeah, that's true, isn't it? In the 14th century, there would have been not much desire to, like go and live a simple life in the forest. People might already do that anyway, but nature was seen as very dangerous in the medieval and early modern Christian tradition as a place where, Jesus and then St. Anthony was surrounded by hallucinations and demons. You might be robbed in the woods. Often woods were, the exclusive preserve of aristocrats or the king for hunting, the forest, like the New Forest. So you wouldn't really want to be in there. This whole idea that we go back to nature and we enjoy an unspoilt life is something that has developed around the time of industrialization. That's why we start seeing it really emerge with something like William Wordsworth. I'm giving this like historical gloss because I want us to kind of think about the value of what Derrida is trying to say. What does nature mean? What does truth? I know truth isn't quite the same, but what does truth mean? In all of these, there is a striving, there is an effort to find truth in nature, to kind of use language to connect, to become one with a certain concept, a certain view. But we can't have that. We would love it, wouldn't we? But what we get instead are these kind of sentimental imaginings and this kind of possibility that it can be deluded. Now, Derrida has a term for this, okay, called the Metaphysics of Presence. So let's get into that. Okay. What does he mean by this? The Metaphysics of Presence. Okay, so he means this. That and this goes back to the whole thing about speech versus writing. Speech, I'm speaking to you, aren't I? Well, I can provide this illusion. I'm actually just speaking to my own computer. Speaking to my own camera. But I provide the illusion that I'm speaking to you because I'm looking at the camera right now and trying to provide a kind of presence, as a form of substitution for the class. Speech in itself offers presence. We speak to each other in a way that must be audible. And we speak and we use not just the words, but we use the tone in which we speak them. It could be very happy or it could be really angry, and suddenly words take on a lot of different meaning in that sense too. Now, writing can't offer that same presence, can it? Because if you're reading something on a page, you don't know, you probably do know, but sometimes you can't quite guess the state of mind of the writer, the emotions that they're trying to communicate. That's what we guess. That's why we have, all sorts of literary interpretation. Now, there is therefore this kind of striving in writing to kind of provide a presence, to kind of use speech, to use emotion, to kind of give a sense of kind of connection or comfort or embeddedness in relations with other people or in other things. And Derrida links this work to thinking about that earlier question about how signifiers relate to signifieds, how the word freedom relates to the concept of freedom. And so when he talks about a metaphysics of presence, what he's trying to kind of derive here is on one level trying to kind of recognize that in making this leap to having our words connect with these abstract things, that there is this kind of effort to kind of transcend, to provide presence, and so on. But it's always going to be illusory because that presence isn't possible. That we can't, nor can we necessarily get beyond the signifiers, the letters, the sounds, and so forth. And what Derrida wants to do instead is what he calls this arche writing, this kind of foundational writing, this basic writing. One that is, it's not hindered by the difference between speech and writing, but it's going to be something different. To be honest, he doesn't really tell us much about what arche writing is going to do. Let's look a little bit at the technique, because I think the real strengths of grammatology, and of Derrida's work more broadly, is in its value for skepticism and in its value for critique. So we get this later on in the reading that I set you. That Derrida kind of sets out the method of deconstruction, and he kind of sets out how we need to think much more skeptically about what language does and how it works. So even here on something like page 7. Now maybe it does come across as quite over the top. Derrida's describing that we're in a crisis of language. Language is menaced in its very life. That there is this kind of earthquake moment in which the coupling, which the links between signifier and signified are unsteady or unstable in different ways. Now we might not really share in that skepticism. We might think, well, maybe that's skepticism that Derrida's bringing, but it wasn't. We weren't in much doubt about these problems in the first place. And maybe that's one thing that this text doesn't quite manage to do. It doesn't manage to succeed that well, I don't think, in persuading us to the urgency of the problem, about why we need to care about this stuff now. There are some interesting grounds for thinking about different narratives. We'll come back to this in a second. But Derrida presents in this early part too some of the controversial terms that he's associated with later. He describes language in terms of a game and a play of signifying references. So language as wordplay, language as a game. These are the things that he will be ridiculed for a bit later. He also talks about how the history of the world has arisen out of different key binaries, and that's something that we can discuss. What does that mean? Well, again, he's got Saussure in mind, these kind of simplistic opposites, night versus day, and so on, and how we think in terms of difference. But sometimes these differences are too constructed. Let's look at a specific aspect of this and see if we can kind of extract more about the method of deconstruction. So Derrida says, the privilege of the phone does not depend upon a choice that could have been avoided. It responds to a moment of economy, let us say, of the life of history, or of being a self-relationship. We'll explore this more in this moment. I'll learn a bit more. The system of hearing, understanding oneself speak through the phonic substance, which presents itself as the non-exterior, non-mundane, therefore non-empirical or non-contingent signifier, has necessarily dominated the history of the world during an entire epoch, and has even produced the idea of the world, the idea of world origin, that arises from the difference between the worldly and the non-worldly, the outside and the inside, ideality and non-ideality, universal and non-universal, transcendental and empirical. There's a lot going on there. So they're just saying that traditionally in Western thought, when there is this kind of supposition of say something like I think, therefore I am, the self that perceives, or in phenomenology in Husserl, in the way he talks about a kind of universal lived experience or universal consciousness, there is this supposition of an inner world that is separate to the outer world. Something that this is, when he talks about non-exterior, non-empirical, non-contingent, this inner world, the life of the mind, the universal self, is presented as something that is necessary universal, is the foundation of thought. Now Derrida is being quite abstruse here, but what he's trying to get to is the whole construction in philosophy of the inner world, of the raised self, of the I. All of it is an achievement of a certain kind of language, of a way of using words to describe a space that exists. And it describes a space in a very divine, almost holy way. Like the kind of the holy mind, holy reason, holy truth. This then raises our philosophers onto the status of being like saints. But the point is, no. This is a kind of, if it's not a pretense, it's a supposition. It's a supposition of language. We could even make this critique of my favourite philosopher, Spinoza. Think about Spinoza's Ethics. If you've ever looked at Spinoza's Ethics, it's an extraordinary work. But the way in which Spinoza produces a book which is meant to explain everything that exists and then the human place within it, all within the frame of substance. And it's presented he presents philosophy in this sort of mathematical way of kind of truths that follow necessarily from another. And it describes everything. And it's wonderful, it's thrilling. But Derrida would say, and this is the criticism that you get in Hegel of Spinoza, that the Ethics could have only written by Spinoza, and it doesn't tell us about all substance, and it doesn't tell us about everything that exists. It tells us about how Spinoza thinks. Because the Ethics isn't about human thought, it's about Spinoza's thought. Just as any work of philosophy must be in some way brought back down to earth. And it must be understood as something that is a product of a person's mind, but also the society and culture in which that mind uses language to represent and to think, and so on. Let's hear from Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, "What therefore is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. Truths are illusions of which one has forgotten that they are illusions." Nietzsche is associated with something that's sometimes called Perspectivism, which is it's like relativism, but it's slightly different. So in case you're not sure, what is relativism? It's the idea that all kind of, I guess, moral or philosophical claims are equal. That your truth is yours and my truth is mine. They're all relative. They all have equal merit. They're true for us, and that's that. Now Nietzsche doesn't quite fall into that kind of sinkhole of despair, because he says, well, actually, some truth systems are of greater value than others. Some are, based on more reliable premises. Some are more rational. Some are more conducive to human well-being or creativity, or a kind of developing masterly new works or ideas and so on. Some perspectives are better than others, basically. Now, if you think about what Derrida is trying to do, here we've been talking about logocentrism, and we've been talking about the ways in which we kind of bring back a thinker or a mode of thought, and we think of it. I guess I'm giving a little bit of summary here. We need to kind of ask two questions of it. One is the ways in which it uses language or not, and the other is the ways in which it reflects its context. And we need to kind of think its context all the time. So what deconstruction is trying to do is trying to bring up what is unclear. It's a strategy of exposing unquestionable metaphysical assumptions and internal contradictions in philosophical texts, but also literary texts as well. It's trying to decenter these assumptions. It's trying to make us question these assumptions. Again, remember that term, the masters of suspicion, from Paul Ricoeur, who replaced the three H's. You remember those three, don't you? Nietzsche, Marx, Freud. So meanings for Derrida are determined by complex historical and linguistic processes. And we need to understand these meanings not just in terms of society. Remember, Derrida doesn't want us just to become kind of social historians, but we need to look at how certain texts relate to other texts. So if we're going to understand Spinoza's Ethics, we need to understand its relation to Descartes. Descartes comes just before Spinoza, and Spinoza is very influenced by him. But then in Spinoza's work, he's always kind of trying to correct Descartes in different ways. Now, if we're going to start doing this kind of deconstructive work, we're going to start finding contradictions, things that, you know, claim to be true or claim to be demonstrated, but they're not demonstrated, they're relied upon, they're unverified. And one of the consequences of deconstruction of this skeptical move is that things that we previously considered untouchable, like a universal being or God or substance, or these structures that Saussure and others are talking about, we're going to start to question them. What makes them universal? Because an implication of what Derrida is saying is that there isn't a universal. It's shaped by language, it's shaped by culture. It's not determinate, it's indeterminate, it's undecided. Right, we're getting there. And let's, in the final part, look at, well, it's not quite the final part, but a final bit of Derrida is the concept of difference. What is that, you are wondering? Well, Derrida says this is what he wants to make a big deal out of. Now, why is it not just difference? You know, why do we have to have it like that? Well, Derrida kind of takes difference and misspells it basically, in order to kind of draw out something different. It's an active process. That to be different can also mean to differ. It can be an active process in which we kind of explore and we help facilitate the possibility of things becoming different, so that things kind of step outside of these binary opposites of, you know, night, day, black, white. Think about that black, white in relation to Fanon. That we step outside of these kind of narrow binaries in which language works, and we instead emphasize not, this is get a little bit dense, and we'll have this when we look at Spinoza actually in a few weeks' time. That when we reduce everything to difference, we are kind of reducing it to like a unity, a one thing, versus its other, like the I and the other. And there was a drive, and this is drawing on Hegel here, where thinking is in a dialectical way. No, it's hard. Where what thinking is doing, the kind of the subject, absolute subject that kind of looks out at the world, that thinking is striving to, well, it encounters its other like in the master-slave struggle, and then it wants to subsume or like incorporate or kind of contain within it that which is different. And so there is basically this move to kind of take what is other or different and subsume it into the same. Kind of, you could imagine here, just imagine like I don't know, like a snowball rolling down a mountain, and it's kind of taking up more and more snow and getting larger and larger and larger like this. Now there's a danger that if everything is reduced to this idea of absorbing things that are contradictory into the same, to oneness, that everything that is different or from everything from minority group or background or way of thinking is going to get lost or caught up in this too. And this is what Derrida, I think, is trying to challenge with the concept of difference. That we're going to kind of, that the deconstructive reading, what it's going to strive to do is find the traces or the marks of things that are different, things that undermine the claims to universality. That in trying to expose contradiction, in trying to expose, you know, different influences or so on, that this isn't just, you know, to kind of show off how clever you are, that, you know, you kind of spot the author's mistakes, but rather it's to point to the fact that no way of thinking, no way of seeing, and no culture is itself homogeneous, nor should it try to be. That everything involves traces of other things. That everything is going, that culture is interrelated. Oh yeah, one other final thing. We're gonna just really briefly. I haven't really got like a good thing for us to look at here. Normally I do. So we'll talk about his legacy in a moment. Should we go back to Nietzsche? Let's go back to Nietzsche. Okay. So there was this thing at the end of the reading that I set you, where Derrida presents this controversial point that there is no such thing outside the text, and it's translated in different ways. The most common way is there is nothing outside the text. Now, the most literal way of translating that is there is no outside text. Now, this comes up in a discussion of Rousseau, And Derrida's point is kind of fair enough, really. It's like, well, you can't separate a philosopher from the system in which they write, how they write and the ways that they use language and how that language is shaped and so forth. That's fair enough, isn't it? But then he presents this, there is nothing outside the text. And, again, it's called a big hissy fit among lots of people. Lots of readers who want to dismiss Derrida quite quickly. They say, well, all Derrida means is that everything is just language, everything is just texts. And you can just interpret them how you want. We can deny the Holocaust, We can just produce an alternative version of history because it's just all text. Now, Derrida is not saying that, okay? He's not saying that, in case you're still not persuaded. It's not a kind of postmodern nihilism that is meant to be coming out here. That everything is just a play of signifiers. Rather, what he's trying to get to, but the problem is he's slipped up himself by the obscure prose in which he writes, and his interest in kind of subtle differences in different ways. What he's trying to get to is that there is nothing outside of the context. That context shapes everything. And if you ask any good historian, they will say the same thing of trying to understand any given issue, any given problem. Context shapes everything, and that comes to reflects the writing of philosophy too. Not just the fact that a certain philosopher was born in a certain town or met a certain person, but it's richer than that. It's the ways in which the philosopher writes. It's the way in which they present themselves, and it's their own relationship to their own concepts, if that makes sense too. And so I guess what Derrida is trying to bring in is a deep literary suspicion of the truth claims of philosophy, to kind of puncture its pretensions. The only downside is that the language itself involves a whole pretentiousness, which might be philosophically justified, but it's very pretentious nonetheless. Which means that me giving you the summary here is all good and well, but even when I've read this material, I've found it hard to kind of draw this out immediately at first sight. It's tough, and Derrida's tough. Let's talk about his legacy. Okay, so I mentioned somebody who hates Derrida. It's John Searle. And John Searle gets into this kind of debate with Derrida where they're basically insulting each other's works. Now, John Searle is interesting because he ends up reading some of Derrida's works, and he presents quite an interesting challenge to off-grammatology. You might agree with his criticism. Basically, John Searle says that Derrida's wrong, but he doesn't say he's wrong because he's an asshole. He says he's wrong because the argument could be completely the other way around. Let's hear John Searle. Quote. Oh yeah, wait, sorry, a bit of context. John Searle here is talking about Derrida's idea of logocentrism, the idea that speech has been privileged over writing, and he says, nope, that's not true. Quote, on the face of it, this claim is bizarre. The distinction between speech and writing is simply not very important to Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, etc. On Derrida's account, however, it is essential not only to Husserl but to philosophy, and indeed to the history of the world during an entire epoch. You'll note I kind of skated through that earlier, didn't I? That's crazy, isn't it? What a sweeping statement. The history of the world during an entire epoch. How can you come up with that? Including the present, that speech should be mistakenly privileged over writing. If Derrida's claim were to be taken at its face value, I believe that a contrary argument could be given equal or even greater plausibility. What do you think? Do you agree? This is something that we'll discuss when we meet. I definitely find the logocentrism part of the argument a little bit more obscure and hard to follow, I've got to say. So let me, in this kind of final part, make a really quick defensive case for Derrida's deconstruction technique. We're going to look at an interview that he gives in 1967, the same year as Off Grammatology, where he's trying to sketch out his position. Derrida. Quote, to deconstruct philosophy is, in this sense, to think the structured genealogy of its concepts in the most faithful internal manner. before we skate on, we'll remember genealogy occurs in Foucault, although for him he's writing in the 1970s. To think about how concepts developed because they are the child of other concepts, think about the family tree, genealogy stuff. To look at how thinking and these concepts are not universal, they don't land fully formed, but they're shaped by the things that have come before and the things that they are around. Derrida continues. But at the same time, on the basis of a certain outside that cannot be qualified or named by philosophy, to determine what may have been concealed or excluded by that history, which became history by way of that repression, which somewhere was always a self-interested one. So off grammatology is a kind of an important work in thinking about this suspicion of literary and philosophical texts, of seeing them, as Foucault would say later, as shaped by power, as being highly Eurocentric, is involving all sorts of presuppositions about how thinking should be and what thinking should do. And the kind of presentation of the truth involves a repression of that which is different, that which is other. We saw this with Foucault in a writing on madness and civilization. And Derrida's making claims like this in a broader way, challenging how philosophers claim to know in a universal way. I think this is really important. Finally, we might want to kind of just keep this in mind in terms of the context of Derrida's own life, which he really doesn't want us to do. So, sorry, Derrida. Of challenging Nazism, of challenging fascism, which is a running preoccupation with a lot of our thinkers on this course. Now, this is from a guy called John D. Caputo. He's defending Derrida here, and he's saying that deconstruction is a very powerful way of challenging totalitarianism, challenging anything which tries to relegate difference and otherness of minorities, tries to push them into the sea. This is always dangerous, and deconstruction therefore is a powerful way of challenging how the status quo use language to kind of subjugate others. Quote, "The idea behind deconstruction is to deconstruct the workings of strong nation states with powerful immigration policies, to deconstruct the rhetoric of nationalism, the politics of place, the metaphysics of native land and native tongue. The idea is to disarm the bombs of identity that nation states build to defend themselves against the stranger, against Jews and Arabs and immigrants." Well, given that what's been running in the background of discourse, there's been everything in the United States about George Floyd. Thinking here about, we might want to keep in mind Fanon and language, about how race is constructed, about how politicians on the right appeal to unities, appeal to the natives against the citizens of the world and other people. Derrida's skepticism is a powerful and a very important tonic. It's just that the tonic, the pharmacon, can sometimes be hard to swallow. It can be very bitter. It might make us feel a bit sick. Hopefully you didn't feel sick when you're reading Derrida. Yep, and he has this whole beef with Foucault. I might try and explain that in the Zoom class when we speak. Here are the discussion points I'd like us to cover when we meet next Monday evening at 6. What characterizes Derrida's approach to philosophy? I then want us to explore how does it reflect the historical and philosophical threads of our course. So I've mentioned some of this: anti-Semitism, the rise of the Nazis. We could talk about Nietzsche. We could try and talk about Husserl and structuralism. What does Derrida mean by deconstruction? How could deconstruction be put into practice? I'm sure we're going to probably want to say somewhere about the legitimacy or not of some of these claims that, Derrida, is all about jargon and elitism and bullshit and things like this. Or whether there is something really useful here. I think there really is. But let's see if we can draw that out. Okay, next week, well, after that one, we're going to turn to May 1968, which we've been talking about a bit already, but we're going to look at two writers associated with the Situationist International, Guy Debord and Raoul Vanderheim. where both these books come out in 67 and they influence the ideas of May 68 in different ways. Du Bois' Society of the Spectacle and Vanheim's Revolution of Everyday Life. We're gonna use this to kind of talk about things that you might have come across already in different places. Psychogeography, the spectacle, the idea of the derive. But more importantly, and this is something that I see a lot of resonances with the Frankfurt School's critique of popular culture, in which mass conformity, capitalism has made us all conformists. We're all caught up in this dream world of consumerism and mass media, and we cannot call the spectacle, and we cannot think our way out of it. Now, are all their ideas, never work, and so on? Is it all just revolutionary, whimsical idealism? That's completely, from work-shy middle-class bohemians. Or is it actually more relevant than ever in its kind of 100% attack on work, on consumerism, on consumption? I really like this material. I'm looking forward to this class. All right, so thanks so much, everyone. Let's see what we make of Derrida next Monday. Thank you.